Hi, my name is Richard Grijalva, and my dad's name was Grey Wolf. And I want to pass on to you a story called The Shadow Warrior. And this story is in 3 parts. And this is part 1. So I want to let you know that this particular story is as old as the sun and as young as the moon. And the words have come across the 4 winds. And our story takes place hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years ago in a village. And in this village, as it was the custom for the men created and with their own hands built these beautiful beads. And there was a talisman attached, and it all had significant meaning to each and every one of these men. But there was one man whose necklace stood out from all the rest. And he would go about the village, and he would stand erect, and he would go, and the men would see what it was that he was doing, and they'd see this beautiful necklace, and they took a vow. They vowed that someday they would take that necklace away from him. And again, as it was the custom of this particular village, the men every Saturday would go down to the river, and there was a grassy area by the river and this big grandfather tree. And the men would go there, and they would form a circle, and they would sing, and they would tell stories as men do, and they would play with one another. You know, this kind of horseplay. And this man would sit outside of the circle, and he would observe what they were doing. Until one day, one of the men came out, and this one man went to him and said, you know, we know we've treated you badly, and we want to invite you to join our circle. And so the man's heart was just bursting, that finally he was being recognized, and finally he was being asked to participate. And so the man went down to join these men in their circle. And as they continued to talk, he looked around, and he noticed that none of them had their necklaces on. And so he asked them, he says, you know, as I look around, I see that none of you have a necklace. He says, and I want to be part of you. So if you tell me where you have hidden or put your necklaces, I will put mine with yours, so I can be part of your group. And then the man looked at him and said, oh, well, today we did something very special. You see, each of us took our necklaces, and we faced that grandfather tree. And as far as the eye can see was this briarwood with all these sharp points. And it was a dark canopy with the rest of the trees. And what we decided to do was to take them off and to say a prayer to the forest demon. And we took it and we flung them as far as we could. And once again, the man's heart was just bursting. And so he decided he would do the same thing, because what an ultimate sacrifice, what a great ritual. So he went before the grandfather tree, and he took his necklace off and stood there for a moment and said a small prayer. And then he took it and he flung it as far as he could into the sharp briarwood. And he remained silent. And as he turned, the men in the circle began to laugh. And they pointed at him and they said, do you think we would be so stupid as to take off our necklaces and throw them into the briarwood, into the forest? And then in this little hole right underneath one of the briarwood, just sitting off to the side, the men went there and they just dug out, and they all took out their necklaces, and they went to the river to wash them off, and they put them on, and they started to laugh, and they left them there, and they went back to the village. Well, the man stood before the grandfather oak tree, and he began to say a small prayer of wanting to get his necklace back, and then he sat down and he just began to weep, just began to cry. And off to the side, he heard a voice which sounded like, come in, come in. But he just thought maybe it was just the wind. And then he heard it again, come in, come in. And so the man did. he went into that hole where the necklaces were, and he found himself going underneath the grandfather oak tree, down the roots, and he continued down until he landed at the very bottom, where he was on his hands and knees, and off to about 100 feet or so, with this little bit of light that was beaming on this old man who was standing over, and he had a hood over his head, and he said to the man, "Lick my wounds, lick my wounds." And the man, without any hesitation, on his hands and knees, went up to him, and he took one hand and he began to lick his wound, and he was licking another wound, and all of a sudden all the rest of the wounds on this man began to heal, and the hood came off, and he stood erect, and he began to have this aura about him. And just about that time they could hear the footsteps of that old forest demon, and he started to run towards them. And the man said, "Get behind me, quick." And as the forest demon says, "I smell the blood of a man," and he came up to this man who was standing there. He says, "I smell the blood of a man," and he says, "You'll never catch him. It's too late. He went that way. He left about an hour ago." And that old forest demon started to go in that direction, chasing that man. And then he brought out the man who came, who had licked his wounds, and he put him in front of him, and he looked into his eyes, and he clapped his hands, and the man appeared back in front of that oak tree where he was standing before, and he clapped his hands again, and there appeared around his neck was a necklace much more magnificent than the one he began with. And he clapped his hands again, and there was a beautiful blanket that was put over his shoulders. And he went to the river to look into the reflection to see this necklace, and he could see his very soul. He could see the essence of himself. And just about that time, it was Saturday again, and the men were coming down, and they saw him there, and they saw the blanket, they saw his necklace, and they went up to him and said, "Where did you get that?" And he pointed to the hole. And before he could stop them, all of them went into that little hole, and they were going down. And he said, "But wait." But it was too late. So they all had gone down there. And these men found themselves going deep below the roots of the grandfather tree, and they fell down in the mud, and it was cold, on their hands and knees. And about 100 feet in front of them was this old man with this hood over his head, and he says to him, "Lick my wounds, lick my wounds." And the men all huddled together, and they were talking among themselves, and they turned around and says, "Have you seen yourself? And you are gross. There's no way we're going to lick those wounds." And just about that time, they could hear that old demon coming back again. He says, "I smell the blood of men. I smell the blood of men." And he ate them. And he spit out their bones, and their bones became bleached, and they became part of that briarwood that was dark and had spines and thorns. And that is how the story ends for this part. So go to part 2 to understand what this story means.